I have for too many years been working on system dynamics applied to understanding national economies. I've been doing this part-time. I've been spending a lot of time on the K-12 education and other things. But it is progressing, and a system dynamics model of the national economy is very different from the econometric models that dominate modeling in economics. Econometric modeling is essentially curve fitting of past data, and it does not dig very deeply into the underlying causes. The system dynamics national model that I want to talk about this afternoon is built up from the policies within the economic system, policies at the level of corporations hiring and setting prices and buying capital equipment, policies in which the Federal Reserve responds to the pressures of unemployment and interest rates and liquidity, and the policies that cause the household to save and to purchase. And when you do this, it leads to a very different view of the nature of economic systems. I would say the purpose of this work might be threefold. First of all, to get a better understanding of economic behavior. Secondly, to resolve some of the conflicts in the field of economics about why behavior is occurring, and then in due course to be able to evaluate different policies at the level of corporations and government to see if one can make economies somewhat better behaved and more desirable. All of this means that in due course, the very nature of what the field of economics is, I think, must change. Economics has been advertised by its academic proponents as a science, the science of economics. In fact, it claims to be the queen of the social sciences because it is more mathematical than the other social sciences. More mathematical in the sense of rigorous derivations from simple and, one must say, rather naive assumptions. Assumptions like profit maximizing for a corporation. Profit maximizing means usually maximizing in the short run, but of course there is a fundamental conflict between maximizing in the short run and maximizing in the long run. And the policies for one are very different from the other, and yet even that shift in time perspective is pretty much absent from academic economics. And also, the analysis is primarily centered on equilibrium economics and differences between different equilibria, and very little on the dynamics of how you go from one form to another. All of this and the weaknesses in the field of economics are understandable if you look at history. The field is confined within the legacy of the pre-computer and the pre-simulation days. And the field has been so sharply defined and has been sufficiently rejecting of other views that it has trapped itself in that history that is far from what can be done these days. To give you a feeling for why one really wants to change the nature of academic economics, I say academic because business economists and institutional economists and others have really quite different and much more, I think, appropriate views. But the attitude within mainstream academia is revealed by a nice little quote from David Collender, who is Johnson Distinguished Professor of Economics at Middlebury College. In an article he wrote, he says, "In a study that Arjo Klammer and I did of graduate economics education, we asked students what would put them on the fast track. Approximately 90% said that knowledge of mathematics and knowledge of modeling were important." Modeling there meaning econometric modeling. Only about 3% said that these were unimportant. Only 10% said that knowledge of economic literature was very important, and only 3% said that knowledge of the economy was very important. 68% said knowledge of the economy was unimportant. In my view, that's still Colander, in my view, these answers suggest that something is terribly wrong in the economics profession and in the incentives that economists perceive. And so it is to address shortcomings of that sort that I hope in due course system dynamics can impact. So a system dynamics approach does not follow the mainstream economic paradigm. Instead, it's much more aligned with institutional economists. Institutional economists are those that do in fact go out and look at the real economy and record what's going on and try to ponder why it's happening. They describe what's happening, they try to explain behavior, and institutional economics was the mainstream back through the 1800s and up to about 1940. Then statistical and simple mathematical analysis took over, and in general, linear analysis and solvable equations, which mean they don't deal with feedback systems and they don't deal with complexity and they don't deal with multi-level systems. The institutional economists, however, who have been rather pushed out of the profession by the mathematical economists, have been pushed out because, in fact, they weren't able to cope with the complexities of those systems which they were describing. They didn't have any way to put together their observations about the pieces of the system and what was implied by those pieces interacting. I look upon the system dynamics national model as an extension of institutional economics in the same way that modeling in the corporation can be seen as extension of case studies. Rather than being a science, economics, I think, should be viewed and defined as a systems profession. In that way, it would be like engineering or medicine or management. Professions that are based on an underlying science, and in this case, economics should be based probably on psychology, the realistic nature of decision making, and feedback dynamics. The reputation of academic economics in business has been going through a considerable change in the last decade or two. A number of the major American corporations have disbanded their economics departments. And I have seen this in the experience I've had in raising money for the System Dynamics National Model. Up to 10 or 15 years ago, any prospective sponsor would ask, what do the Harvard and MIT economists think of what you're doing? And an honest answer became a hurdle. In the last 10 years, I've never been asked that question. And usually, one can sense that the best thing you can do to have an organization join in the activity is to say that the mainstream economists do not like it. Because more and more people are searching for something different, and corporate and private sponsors, private individuals, know that you can't guarantee success. They're willing to take risks. The System Dynamics National Model is built up from internal policies that control decisions. It's not from historical data. The historical data is used in a different way. The kind of behavior you see in the economy should be generated by the model. You should be able to look at the output of the model and say, it agrees with the sorts of things going on in real life in various ways, and I will touch on a bit of that to the extent that we have time. The national model has about 250 level equations. It is therefore a 250th order, highly nonlinear system, total equations being around 3,000. I discovered the other day that I'm a very small player in this game. I had an email from a man in China who said that he had written up an economic model with 500,000 equations. And his question to me was, now what software should he use to run it? The national model uses a solution interval of 1/16 of a year, and that's so that the short-term things like business cycles can be represented. Simulations normally are run over 200 years, from the year 1800 to the year 2000, and you can do such a simulation in something under a minute on today's desktop machines. I myself have been using the full professional version of VenSim for this work. It's built up from internal structure, from corporate policies, from the flows of information, labor, money, goods, and capital plant. A lot of economic models don't distinguish the real units. They kind of represent everything in money terms. And it is in the coupling between the flow of goods and prices and money that you get a lot of the interesting sorts of transformations in a real life system. The model contains a set of sectors abbreviated from real life, but I think adequate for most of what we want to do. A consumer goods sector, a capital goods sector that provides the capital plant for itself and for the consumer goods sector. Labor movement between the sectors, between the goods sector, the capital sector, the government sector, and the people remaining in the household. A household sector, a banking system, which represents a balance sheet between all of the various sectors. The Federal Reserve with embedded policies as to how the Federal Reserve reacts to 4 or 5 different inputs: liquidity, interest rates, change in interest rates, unemployment, liquidity. And a government sector that buys goods, hires people, buys capital plant, pays wages, pays welfare, and a few other functions. To give you a little feeling for what I would say is the richness of decision making, I'll just show you the inputs to the ordering function that a production sector uses for ordering capital plant or labor, hiring an ordering function. The ordering function is the same. The national model uses the dimensional facilities of VenSim, and so quite a few equations are written as one equation, but in the model really expand into maybe 6 equations, like 2 factors, 2 sectors. So you get a multiplicity of equations in the real functioning model from a smaller number of actual written equations. But an ordering function would take as an input the desired production, the inventory of factor, delivery delay of factor, inventory of output, backlog of output, desired factor intensity, marginal productivity, the price of the output, price of the factor, growth expectations. There are a lot of trend functions in the model giving you expectations of various sorts for various purposes, profitability, interest rates, and financial pressures. Those would all go into decisions about hiring or employment. The model was developed initially without any overriding view of what modes it was supposed to represent. Somewhat contrary, perhaps, to the way we say that one should build a model where you should have all of the various modes in mind to start with. This was more a matter of seeing what modes would evolve out of the known structures. And it turns out that almost all of the observed modes in the economy do in fact come out of quite common and ordinary policies scattered through the economic system. One finds that you get a generation of the short-term business cycles, the economic long wave, or so-called Kondratiev cycle that I do want to spend some time on today, money inflation, growth of population, and technology. I think this afternoon we'll focus only on the first two, the two major oscillatory modes, the business cycle and the economic long wave. The business cycle is the one known to most people. That's the most common one. It is the fluctuation in the economy that may run 3 to 10 years between peaks. In spite of the consternation it causes, it's a relatively small amplitude, and it appears to be a damped oscillation in the sense that if there were no randomness in the system, it would die out. It's kept alive by a continuous stream of randomness everywhere in the system. The economic long wave is a rather different sort of thing. Its peaks are 45 to 60, maybe 45 to 70 years between peaks. It is of much larger amplitude, and it appears to be an unstable mode, meaning that it tends to grow. And it grows until restrained by nonlinearities, the obvious ones. You can't hire more people than there are. You don't generally think of negative inventories. But there are limitations throughout the economy and the model that begin to produce restraints as you move away from what might be called the optimum and desirable conditions. The high degree of nonlinearity almost everywhere is at the bottom of making much of the realistic behavior. The dominant variables in the business cycle, we think, are essentially inventory fluctuations. Fluctuations in inventory, backlog, hiring, and production. Most of you in this group have played the so-called beer game. I think maybe it's even on the schedule tomorrow morning. And that is essentially the core, we see, of the business cycle. In the beer game, you'll get a much shorter periodicity because it is such a simple structure. But basically, it is that oscillation of internally generated oscillation of inventories, production, and employment. The economic long wave is in some ways similar, but revolves around the same kinds of things on the capital plant side of the sector. The over and under production of capital plant. And there are very powerful driving forces that produce overproduction. And when that has gone far enough, then it reverses. One has excess capital plant, and the capital sectors collapse very strongly because they've done their job, so to speak. They've done their job for 10 or 20 years. There's plenty of capital plant to last for a very long time. And so the demand for capital plant falls off. And then consumer income and asset speculation enter into it, and we'll have more to say about that in a moment. A simulation from the national model over a period of 200 years gives you this kind of a picture. You can see in this the growth trends, behind which are growth in population, growth in government, and growth in technology. You can see the economic long wave. This is for total private employment. You can see the economic long wave, and you can see the small ripple on that, which is the short-term business cycle. The long wave amplitude in real life and in the simulations are considerably bigger than the business cycle. Focusing for a little bit on business cycles, they are essentially an irregular, fluctuating economic activity, peaks 3 to 10 years apart. They've existed for 200 years at least. They're much discussed, they're most familiar, and there has been no theory as to how they're caused. No accepted theory. No theory that persists for more than a decade. In the field of economics, theories about the cause of the business cycle shift every 10 years or so because of one reason or another. But they tend to revolve around perhaps these four principal concepts. The production inventory behavior, the so-called multiplier-accelerator, which I will come to in a moment, monetary explanations of the business cycle, and just outside shocks. And as I say, there's been, if you look at economics textbooks, there isn't really any standard, accepted, universal theory of the short-term business cycle, which is the most obvious of the behaviors. If you look more deeply into this through a simulation, this is a simulation from the national model again, a simulation of a little fragment where the main thing you see is the business cycle. The time span is not long enough to see much of the economic long wave. I think this was taken at the beginning from a starting equilibrium position in the model so that you don't see much of the long wave anyway. But I put this up because there are very interesting and significant amplitude and time phases between the various variables. And one can draw from the national model a large number of variables throughout the economy to see how they are related one to the other in a business cycle. And this becomes one of the tests of confidence in a model because there is a well-established literature of observations about the nature of the business cycle. They fall into two categories: the relative amplitudes of activity. Production fluctuates more than sales. Manufacturers' sales have a greater amplitude than wholesaler sales. You'll see this in the beer game. Wholesaler sales, greater amplitude than retail sales. Orders for durables, much greater fluctuation than shipments. And all of those relationships make their appearance in the corresponding variables in the national model. And then you have a history. This data you see is taken from studies in the literature of actual business cycles. And you have also the average timing differences between variables. This one is revolves around non-agricultural employment as the reference point, and then months of lead or lag relative to that variable, with new capital orders coming 15 or so months before the peak of employment, and some things like wage cost per unit of output lagging as much as 6 months after the peak of employment. And again, you will find more or less the same kind of thing among those variables in the national model. And this gives rise to what's referred to as the leading indicators and the lagging indicators, which are much discussed in the business literature. The only problem is that leading indicators don't always lead, and lagging indicators don't always lag. On the average, they lead, and on the average, they lag. But in a particular situation, you can't be sure. And again, in a national model, you will see that uncertainty because it's a consequence of the random noise that's embedded in the system and actually driving and sustaining the business cycle. Just to give you a feeling for some of the feedback loops that get involved in a business cycle, we have here consumer demand coming to the production of goods, desired production, demand relative to present production, the hiring of new workers, the lengthening, shortening of the work week, the changing of productivity. And then out here, the household income as a consequence of employment and work week bringing money back to the household, which is one of the inputs to demand. If you activate just that part of the model and take consumer demand as constant, except for an impulse, just an initial imbalance, you see a business cycle which is essentially damped and which has time phasing between production and orders from the household and inventory. Orders from the household is constant in this case. And then we turn our attention to one of the theories of causation of the business cycle in the economics literature, the so-called multiplier-accelerator feedback, which revolves around the idea that increasing consumer demand increases production, increases wages, increases the demand for capital plant, increases borrowing to buy capital plant, increases wages for constructing capital plant. Wage increases come back to increase consumer demand, which puts an upward pressure on production. And this concept of a positive feedback loop is taken as an explanation for the rising part of the short-term 3 to 10-year business cycle, and it runs its course and falters and turns back in the other direction. And you get that theory in economic literature because it represents a mental simulation and solution to what this particular loop structure is thought to imply. If, however, you activate, I said in that previous diagram that the prior simulation was with constant demand. If you now make demand dependent on income, you get this, which is to say the business cycle dies out faster than it did before. It is a positive feedback loop. That positive feedback loop is strongly suppressing of the business cycle, not accentuating it. A lot of people don't realize that a positive feedback loop can be strongly damping in a system. Back in the early 40s, when I was designing oil-driven hydraulic machinery, feedback systems for military applications, we filed a patent in which a positive feedback loop was the strong damper on short-term oscillations of a gun mount, which would go like that, but with this positive feedback loop, it would go like that. And it was rejected by the patent office on the basis that it obviously was incorrect because it had this positive feedback loop. Well, that was the invention. What we have here, you see, is a complete misconception based on mental simulation. And in fact, we didn't discover this. If you go back into the 1950s, there is a nice paper by a British economist, and I have not in the last few weeks been able to recover the citation. But anyway, there's a nice paper in which he hand simulated and computed this particular process and demonstrated exactly that, in fact, that positive feedback was damping. And there have been a number of system dynamics models by different people for different purposes with, the normal range of different structures that all show that that positive feedback is damping for the short-term business cycle, but is a powerful contributor to the instability of the economic long wave, the 45 to 70-year oscillations. So you have the interesting anomaly that in the mainstream of American economics, the multiplier accelerator is thought to drive the business cycle when it is quite the reverse. And there is a denial that there is such a thing as the economic long wave. And so you have a situation in which the theory they ascribe to the business cycle is wrong, and that theory is in fact a driving force in a behavior mode that they say does not exist. Some interesting things happen from just geometric superposition. The top curve and the middle one are simply sine waves, no simulation. I mean, they're just curves. The top one being a periodicity typical of the business cycle. The middle one being a long period like the economic long wave. And the bottom one simply an addition of the two. And this tells you a very interesting thing. In the late 1960s and in the 1970s, there is a body of economic literature and conferences under such headings as "Where has the business cycle gone?" or "The death of the business cycle." In other words, the business cycle had more or less disappeared, and it was attributed to the wisdom of Keynesian economics and monetary policy. About the time that that philosophy had taken root, the business cycle came back with a vengeance. And look at this diagram. Simply the addition of these two curves produced this. And in the 50s and 60s here, you see that you get, if you interpret this as being just the business cycle and do not see that it is the superimposition of two very different behavior modes, then you see a business cycle with very strong rises and very weak recessions, strong rises, weak recessions. But you go to the peak and over the peak, and you find the recessions are very deep, and the recoveries are very, recessions are very strong, the recoveries are very weak. Simply a geometry of putting those two together go a significant distance in describing some of the confusions that exist in the literature. And if you look at a computer simulation, national model simulation, you get this, which is most of a cycle of the long wave with the business cycle superimposed. Now that's a little bit different from the previous slide. The previous slide was simply an addition of the two, and here you have the two in a system coexisting, and during the rise, the business cycle is even less visible than it was before, and over here it is more visible than it was before, and I believe the reason for this is that there's an active suppression of the business cycle by the long wave during the climb, and there is a releasing of the restraints and a full amplitude of the business cycle during the decline. That suppression here is an upper limit set, suppressed by the shortage of capital plant and the shortage of extra labor, and minima, which are suppressed and raised by the excess of demand. And so there are a whole set of forces during that rising period that tend to squeeze the business cycle out of existence. You get over the peak, and those restraining forces essentially disappear. If you look at a bit of history, now this one is real data plotted in a particular way. Here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 business cycles defined pretty much as they are defined by the Bureau of Economic Research. And the way they're plotted here is that the very long-term trend, the 200-year trend in the economy, which is a growth rate of about 3.4%, is extracted from the data. And therefore, the trend in this diagram is the horizontal line in the middle. And now we're looking at business cycles relative to the trend, which represents the long-term trend in the economy. And you see an interesting thing. The business cycle that started in 1961 rose well above the trend and ended above the trend line. And we interpret that as being the boosting effect of the economic long wave. But there is actually in this curve a combination of the business cycle and the long wave. If you look at the next one, which I guess is here, you find again it rose above the trend line and dropped back. And you find now that more and more they're dropping below the trend line at the end, and the most recent recovery never climbs above the trend line. It simply slumps off, going downhill from the trend line. And we interpret that as being the effect of moving from the rising, strongly rising part of the economic long wave over to the peak, maybe a bit beyond the peak. So saying, let's then turn our attention to the economic long wave for a moment. It is this big fluctuation in the economy that I suggest represents the Great Depressions of the 1830s, the 1890s, the 1930s, and perhaps also in the 1990s. In fact, we're well into the indicators of a peak period, which we can touch on as we go along here. Revolve around overinvestment, the so-called see-through office buildings that you find many places in the world, especially a few years back. Office buildings basically unoccupied, things like Canary Wharf in England. Monetary policies that tend to They try to extend the expansion because they don't want to kill off the good times, and so the monetary policies tend to favor the overexpansion. The real interest rate is very important, and I'll come to it in a moment. A debt buildup is one of the things that eventually causes the long wave to collapse. If you'll read the business literature, you'll find that some fair fraction of the Pacific Rim companies have banks that have negative net worths. This is a real problem if any kind of economic difficulty begins to develop. And we've had our own banking problems in this country, of course. The excess capital plant finally reaches a point where it doesn't make any sense, and people stop buying capital plant, and then the capital sectors get into difficulty, and that tends to erode confidence. And then, of course, a great deal of the expansion was based on expectations of further expansion, and when those expectations are dashed, then they cease to contribute to what's going on in the economy. There are a number of powerful driving loops for the economic long wave. I might say a word about how we got into this. I had never heard of the economic long wave when we started doing this modeling. And having put together a consumer goods sector and a capital sector, I found that we were getting a huge rise and fall of economic activity. Now, when that kind of unexpected behavior occurs in a model that's relatively new, you properly assume you've made some blunder, that you have a divide where it's supposed to be multiply or something. And so you go and find it, and very often you do find, in fact, that it is a blunder. But as a model gets better and better, there's a rising expectation that it's telling you something about real life that you did not know before. And that's happened in every modeling that I've ever undertaken, that one discovers something often quite dramatic that fits the real life, and yet sometimes nobody had even observed the symptoms, or in any case they had never observed or pondered the causes. For example, a young man who did a model of how the body handles insulin and glucose in various aspects of diabetes found in a computer simulation. I've forgotten the details, but some sort of insulin or glucose injection into his computer person found some unexpected behavior that had not been reported in the literature. Okay, so what's wrong with the model? He didn't see anything wrong. He took it back to the research doctors in diabetes that he'd been working with, and they looked at this whole ensemble of what was going on in the model and said, well, you know, we had a patient like that once, but we always thought it was a mistake in the measurements. You develop a new medical syndrome in the computer that now, when you see it in the model and you come to believe there's nothing wrong with the model, you go out into real life and look, and the chances are fairly high you will find it. In my urban dynamics work, we put in a perfect job training program in the model at one stage, and unemployment in the city went up. I found that surprising. I took it back to Mayor Collins and the other urban people we'd been working with and said, now what do you think of the model? Perfect job training program and unemployment goes up. They sat there in dead silence for about a minute, and one of them said, oh. Said, Detroit has the best job training program in the country and the most rapidly rising rate of unemployment. Then I went to people in the business of running job training programs, and I said, have you ever heard of a situation where a job training program would cause a rise in unemployment? They said, of course. When that happens, we go to another city. Let me touch on two or three of these. The capital self-ordering is, I think, a relatively weak force compared to the others, but it's easy to understand, so let's look at it. A situation where if demand in the goods sector goes up, it orders more capital plant, and the capital sector, in order to have more capital plant, orders capital plant, essentially from the capital sector and from itself. So an increase in demand is a demand not only for the customer, but also for the capital sector itself. There's a nice long wave game that John Sterman has developed, which, if you haven't seen it, is worth getting. It's a computer simulation game of the long wave in which you have one decision to make, and that is how much capital plant to order for the capital sector. You're the operator of the capital plant, and you order capital, physical capital, for use in the capital sector. And everything is on the screen. Absolutely everything is on the screen in front of you. And it's no more complicated, really, than what you see here. And you can essentially count on almost everybody generating 30, 40, 50-year cyclic behavior in that model. I watched two people play it one day, one an MIT economist, the other the recently retired vice president of manufacturing of TRW. And they generated the typical long wave behavior. The economist thought he had somehow or other been tricked. I asked the manufacturing vice president what he thought of it, and he says, I've relived my whole life. The effect of real interest rates is extremely important. Real interest rates affect the willingness to borrow for new capital plant, and they also affect the household's willingness to save. The data and the regression analyses on the economy are ambiguous and contradictory as to what the effect of real interest rate is on the household's willingness to save. On the other hand, we have to make a decision in the model, and there are theoretical arguments on both sides. And in the model, desired purchases are essentially that. They are the income, input to purchasing, multiplied by the effective real return plus the asset input to purchasing. In other words, if you had no income but huge numbers of assets, you would still be able to purchase. So both of those enter in, and there's a huge literature on all of that. And the question is, what should the nature of ERRP be? What in direction, in fact, does it go? And you have the blank curve in your handout. You might ponder what you would draw. It's very interesting to have people try this. I don't think we'll take time this afternoon to get your nominations for the shape, but basically the literature says it's either downward sloping or upward sloping or doesn't matter, which pretty well covers the range. But a system dynamics approach to things like this should include the question, what happens in extreme circumstances? What happens if the real interest rate is 140%, or 150%, or 300%? Suppose that if you will put your money in the bank and a month later you can draw out 1.5 or 2 times as much, what's the pressure on you to put it in the bank? It's pretty strong. Conversely, suppose that you put it in the bank and a month later you only get 75% of it back. What is the pressure on wanting to save rather than going out and purchasing things? And in hyperinflation, like Germany in the 1920s, people would get their huge amount of money in a wheelbarrow in the morning and rush to a store to buy something as quickly as possible because prices were being raised 4 times a day in the stores. And so you did not want to put that money away as a dollar deposit anywhere. So our answer to that is that it comes down, it's probably low slope here, and it goes strongly in the downward direction, which there is a body of economic literature contrary to that, but I think that literature is probably wrong. A computer simulation relative to real interest rates is, shall we say, interesting. Here is basically one economic long wave. And this black line is real GNP, physical output. And the inflation rate is high through this period and drops off rather steeply. The nominal interest rate, bank interest, is low through this period as it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, rises steeply as it did in the late 80s. And the real interest rate, which is bank interest minus inflation, has this kind of a shape. It's low in the late stages of the expansion, which means it's a powerful influence to produce more capital investment, more building, more shopping centers, more office buildings, more housing. And then as you get into the vicinity of the peak, the real interest rate rises sharply. And so you come to a period in time where you've already overbuilt the capital plant in the economy, and the incentives suddenly change. In addition to having too much, the incentives for building more reverse. If you look at agricultural land values peaked around 1980. In the late 70s, real interest rate on agricultural land was as low as minus 5%, which meant that if you borrowed all the money to buy a farm at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year you sold it, paid off your loan, and paid all the interest, you were 5% ahead. Tremendous incentive for speculation in farmland. By the mid-80s, the real interest rate on farmland was plus 30%. 10% bank interest minus a minus inflation, in other words, plus a deflation of 20% a year. And so you had a set of forces that dropped the bottom out of a speculative market. And those are observable in real life, and the whole driving mechanisms for them are observable in the simulation model. One can, as one ponders the behavior and all of the interrelationships you can see, you get interesting insights about the nature of the economy. One of them is just to look at the matter of productivity. Ordinarily, productivity, I think, is defined by people as the production per person on the production line, in direct production, the people making goods, growing food, constructing buildings. And that is, in my opinion, the wrong definition. It should be the output of those things per capita excuse me, for the society as a whole. How much is being produced per capita, because that determines the standard of living. As soon as you begin to look at it that way, then you ask, and who is doing the production? And I would suggest that only about 10% of people are in fact in that direct production. Only about 10% producing the goods, buildings, and food that we use. 90% are in a very, very broadly defined category of overhead, including most of us. Just imagine that a ninth of the people in overhead were put back into direct production. This would double the physical output because the capital plant out there is sufficient as it stands to do that. You would double the output, you would double the standard of living or reduce the cost of living by a factor of 2. There are big changes that are fundamentally possible, and never mind the arguments about whether you can get 3% more productivity. One should be focusing on how you get 100% more if you want it. Now, then people say, but what would we do with all those goods? And then I say, well, if that's your view, then why worry about productivity? I think I'll pause there and take questions. I believe that there are microphones going to be taken to those people that indicate they want to ask questions or make a comment. It can be about what I've said or about anything that you think I can be helpful to you on.
I understand that in addition to not liking system dynamicists, that the mainstream economists tend not to like the folks out at the Santa Fe Institute who are doing work in complexity theory and emergent behavior in economies. And I wondered if
it's an equal opportunity viewpoint.
That's right. That's right. I wonder if you have comments on the relationship between some of that work that's been done and your work looking at the national economy.
Some of which work?
Some of the work that's been done at the Santa Fe Institute, Brian Arthur and the emergent behavior folks.
I don't think I know it well enough to really be qualified to make any important comment. They're very good people, and it's interesting. I think part of it is on chaos. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think it grew out of chaos.
And I don't think that chaos is necessarily the big deal. I think that what's going on in our corporations and in the economy is largely the result of non-chaotic behavior, although it is quite clear, as you can see in one of John Sturman's papers about essentially the beer game or the production distribution system, there are regions of chaotic behavior, although they're not regions that most people get into, but maybe some do, and perhaps you can. But I have not taken the study of chaos too seriously, and it may be just a shortage of time, but in any case, I haven't.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
It's sort of a double question on the application of this model. In the ultimate, will it be able to consider the trade flows? The US economy exists in a world, and so there are always possibilities of exchanging goods and people. Second, what would be the challenges in using it in, let's say, a developing economy, which may not have the same decision rules as you found when you were investigating the US national model?
With respect to the world, we sometimes interpret the national model as a world economy model. I think you can do that. With respect to other kinds of economies, I would hope the national model comes fairly close to meeting my philosophy of how you should do models, and that is you should not do a model of the specific problem in which you are interested. You should make a model of the family of systems to which your specific one belongs, because you should want to understand why your specific system is different from others that might superficially look like the same but are clearly behaving differently. Why is your company losing market share and some competitor is not? Why has one company for decades had a higher profit ratio than another company in the same industry? You want a model that spans all of those, and I would hope that the national model might, with the changes in parameters, be applicable to a developing country, to a communist country, to a capitalist country, simply because they all use people, they all use capital plant, they all probably have a financial system of some sort, and money flows. And so the fundamentals of any economy are probably there. We haven't tried to tailor it to specific cases, but I would think you would go a long way toward fitting it to particular countries by the judicious examination of parameters and policies and making some adjustments. And you might find that you wanted to make some adjustments in structure. I wouldn't rule that out, but it's probably a reasonable start.
My question is, I wonder if nestled in your model is a model of the American stock market, and or if anyone is using systems modeling for the stock market. That's just it looks like it would be a place to apply it.
We have not represented the stock market separately. I think it is, reasonably correlated with the capital expansion. There is an interesting relationship between speculative crescendos in the economy. If you go back to 1920, there was a peak of agricultural land prices and a collapse. In 1980, there was a similar peaking and collapse. In the mid-1920s, there was the land boom in Florida and a collapse. In the late 1980s, the urban land boom and office building and a collapse, office buildings selling at half or less of what they were at the peak. And the last speculative crescendo in the 1920s was the stock market, the Wall Street stock market, which peaked in 1928, collapsed into 29 and the 30s. And we are at, I think, such a peak in the equities market. And I do not know of any law, and the sectors in the national model are not sufficiently disaggregated to give an obvious reason why agricultural land might peak before the stock market. But having run through most of the possible speculative excesses and ending up with the only one that's left, which is the stock market, I think when it collapses, that may well be the end of the top plateau of the economic long wave.
What assumptions did you make about the flow of information, particularly in the last 10 years? And if the assumption was that information would be increasing, the flow of information would be increasing, what impact does that have on the rest of the model?
None. Not in the model, and I think not in the economy. The whole idea that rapid flows of information make a difference, I think, is misguided. The big delays are people's willingness to believe the information. And so the economic long wave existed when clipper ships carried the information. And I don't think, and if anything, it's gotten longer rather than shorter. with modern communications, but probably not for reasons directly related to communications. I think it's gotten longer this time because of excessive money creation by the monetary authorities in the world. The kind of obvious flow of information, telephone, television, internet. First of all, probably the worst pollution we have is information pollution, the overwhelming nature of information. So that slows down the perception of what matters. There's such an overwhelming body of irrelevant information that it may take years to sort out what does matter and decide what to pay attention to. So I would say, look at the own situation. Let's assume that system dynamics is a wonderful way to design policy, and it's been known for 30 years. Have all of your managements embraced it? Not quite. It will take them another 20 to 30 years before they get there. So they will have taken 50 years to absorb and use something. Not a lack of information being available, it is a lack of how you change people's thoughts, paradigms, expectations, prejudices. And so throughout the system, I think you will find that the speeding up of the sort of momentary information flows, I think, is relatively unimportant. The national model is initialized in the year 1800, runs without any parameter changes, without any policy changes for 200 years, and pretty much behaves like the economies have. Nothing important has changed in 200 years when it comes to the fundamental nature of the economy. How do you like that?
Sir, could you mention how the model handles how war has impacted the economy, the different wars, and the defense industry?
A war in the national economy could be handled by simply putting an imposed 4-year load on manpower and goods, just simply taking them out of the economy. Now, I haven't really done this, but my expectation is that something like World War II is a very small piece of change compared to the power of the economic long wave. And that the effect of it is probably to change the length of the long wave by a few years, but not in any fundamental and important way. But the way we would deal with it in the national model is simply to go in and extract labor, pull labor out of the production sectors, pull out goods away from household consumption, let that go on for a period of time, then stop it, and look at the transients that were produced. I don't see it as a big deal in the big picture. I mean, in the short run, of course, it's very dislocating, but I don't think in the long run it amounts to a great deal. That's my guess, but we haven't really thoroughly explored it. Okay. All right, been fun being with you.